Jason Smith, Director of NYP's work in Northern Manhattan Parks. I've been working here for a long time, and one of the most interesting and challenging pieces of that has been trying to figure out how to protect our wetlands and do a better job stewarding the waterfront. And that's really an ongoing challenge and project that I think has a lot to the city as a whole as we learn how to adapt to climate change and improve public access to the waterfront. So this is a series of scientists that we've worked with that are sharing their work. And then we're going to follow up the presentations with dialogue Q&A. And critically, at the end, we're asking folks to think about if there's anything that came up today that raised some questions for you that you'd like to learn more about, or suggested a topic that you could see working with NYRP at Sherman Creek about. And so we have an option for that feedback in person, and there's also going to be that option online for the folks who are joining us via Zoom. So please stick with us for the full program if you can. But of course, you can always contact me or Kaio, who's the engagement coordinator for Northern Manhattan Parks, about anything we talk about at any point. So New York Restoration Project is a nonprofit that's committed to renovating, restoring, caring for green space throughout New York City, particularly to address equity challenges with green space, making sure that all New Yorkers have access to high quality green space. It's an aspirational mission. A lot of it can be found in our tree giveaways or our garden renovation program, our community gardens, or our park project, which is focused here in Northern Manhattan. Just a little note, this is being recorded, so keep that in mind. We'll share the presentation on YouTube afterwards. So we want to have a very open dialogue, but we do want to keep it constructive and positive. Well, not necessarily positive. I'm fine if we get negative. Just briefly, I'm really honored to introduce Chester Zarnoch. Dr. Zarnoch has been doing some work with NYRP, which has been incredible to see with his students at CUNY, focused on marine invertebrate biodiversity and restoration, and can we get mussels going with our wetland restoration? And he's always most often found out in the mud with students doing very interesting, very important applied science in the estuary. And he's not only supported NYRP, but the Villian Oyster Project and City Island Oyster Reef and other folks who are really doing on the ground work to improve water quality and the shoreline. He's a professor of environmental studies and biology at Baruch, City University, and the Graduate Center. He's also affiliated with the Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, which is a great organization that leads a lot of this work and focused on resilience in Jamaica Bay. He's been an active researcher in marine ecology and aquaculture since 2001, has published papers on shellfish biology, sediment, nitrogen cycling, which is really important, but makes my head hurt when you start to get into the details. So I really respect Chester's work on nitrogen cycling. Salt marsh ecology and intensive aquaculture. His current research aims to develop and evaluate nature-based solutions for improving water quality in aquatic ecosystems and for making urban shorelines more resilient to climate change. Chester holds a PhD in biology from the Graduate Center, 2006. So Chester's going to present. We're going to have some open dialogue Q&A and then some opportunity for feedback. So take it away, Chester.
All right. So good news, Jason. I'm not going to make your head hurt today. Talking about nitrogen cycling. Well, I may make your head hurt talking about other things, but so yeah, I'm gonna start real quick with just giving a plug to my affiliation. So I am a faculty member at Baruch College. I'm in my 18th year there, and so Baruch College, most people think of as being a business school, but we do have a large and growing science population, a population of science students. Biology major, environmental sustainability minor. And then this fall, because our programs have been growing, we're adding 2 majors in environmental science and environmental studies. And we're also the home of a CUNY-wide program called the CUNY Climate Scholars. So this is a program focused on interdisciplinary climate change studies that any student across CUNY can apply for, and where they get a comprehensive education on interdisciplinary issues related to climate change, do a research project with a CUNY faculty member, and then get placed at an internship site around the city. So that's a really successful and powerful program. Baruch is known for its return on investment for students, and our programs in particular in the sciences are very much focused on hands-on learning, hands-on experiences. And so we get our students out and into the fields, away from 23rd Street and out in the fields all the time, including right here in Sherman Creek Park and other local parks like the Hudson River Park Trust. So, and I'm also affiliated with the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay. So this is a CUNY-wide institute that is a partnership between CUNY, the City of New York, the Department of Environmental Protection, the National Park Service, the Gateway National Recreation Area. And the idea there is to sort of coordinate science among agencies so that we can promote this sort of integrated knowledge across these different groups to be able to increase biodiversity, increase resilience for the communities around Jamaica Bay, but also all over New York City. And the Science and Resilience Institute has three main focuses: resilience in Jamaica Bay and the community surrounding Jamaica Bay, addressing flooding or across New York City, and then using nature-based solutions for some of the major environmental issues that we're faced with. And of course, you guys are all familiar. You know, one of the major issues that we're dealing with here is climate change and sea level rise. We have communities across New York City that are getting flooded regularly each month during high tides, moon tides, and have difficulty getting to work, getting out of their house, and these kinds of issues have just been getting more and more frequent and more dire. So we're thinking about solutions related to climate change and sea level rise, and part of that is thinking about nature-based approaches. And we know that if we look at the places that experience some of the most flooding in and around New York City, these are places that were once wetlands or salt marshes and have been filled in by landfill. So we've essentially built out about 20% of the area of New York City has been built out by filling in landfills, filling in salt marshes with fill. And if you look at this map, all these areas in black are these places where we filled in, and many of these places are places that are experiencing chronic flooding due to sea level rise and storm events, extreme storm events, etc. And so we've lost the important function that these wetlands once provided, is creating a buffer, attenuating wave energy, and mitigating some of the potential storm impacts that we have. And because of the fact that we've lost so much salt marsh and we continue to lose salt marsh, there's a lot of interest in trying to bring it back, try and rebuild it, restore it, and regain all of the benefits that the salt marshes provide. And one way in which we're seeing this play out is the construction of what is what's called living shorelines. So in places where you're experiencing flooding or experiencing shoreline erosion, you have a couple of choices in which you can deal with it. One is to build a wall and bulkhead of some kind and take this really hard engineering approach. And that's the way we've done it for years. And what we're starting to see over the last 2 decades is a shift in thinking about a more natural approach or integrating aspects of natural systems into these hard engineered shorelines. And so we call these things living shorelines, and there are a variety, is a spectrum of these kinds of shorelines, and you can have purely vegetation, you can have combinations of vegetation and rock, you can have various different approaches, and I'll show you a couple today. But the idea is that rather than just having this hard structure like a bulkhead that provides very little ecological improvement or enhancements, it provides very little social or recreational benefits. You can have these greener structures that may be able to provide ecological and social benefits. And so what's been happening is that more and more we're seeing agencies and businesses and nonprofits exploring their options. What end of the spectrum do you go to minimize shoreline erosion? And in a lot of cases, what we're seeing now is that the cost-benefit analysis is starting to favor living shorelines. And so more and more of these living shorelines are being built across the city. And it's a relatively new technology, right? And there's a reason why erosion is happening in that place to begin with. And so you need to understand what's potentially causing the erosion. If you build something that's natural, will it be able to persist? Do you have to put in some kind of mechanisms, hard structures to protect that natural substrate that you put out there? So there are a lot of questions that we still need to address and understand. And there's lots of money to build these things, not a lot of money to study them. And so what we've been sort of, anytime I get a chance to get on the soapbox and talk about this, I say that we really need to be designing experiments within construction projects, right? If we're going to have all this capital funding to build something, let's include some funding to be able to do the science so that we learn from what we build and we can do a better job into the future. And so this is sort of the approach that we've been taking with partners like New York Restoration Project and other partners around the city. And I'll talk about a handful of these projects with you all. And so this is a busy slide, but I really like this slide because for a number of reasons, I love this language, nature's contribution to people. And we think about nature-based solutions, we're really trying to capture these contributions to people, and these contributions, like I mentioned before, can be ecological, they can be social. There's all these different kinds of benefits that we can get from them. But if we're going to say that we're going to build something to get these benefits, we need to be able to document that they're providing these benefits. So we need to be able to do the science, the monitoring, to be able to say, yeah, we can build these things and get these benefits, or we built these things and we're not getting benefits, and this is why. And so what I also like about this slide is that I think any person who has an interest, any person that's in this meeting right now, can find a place where they can contribute to this idea of nature-based solutions. Right? Everybody has a place. Everybody can have a place in this. And I think, whether it's, participating in the decision-making process to lead to policies, encouraging your elected officials to invest in these kinds of things, participating in programs like this, the environmental science stewards that New York Restoration Projects is setting up this year. Participating in the monitoring of the ecological and the social benefits. We need people to contribute to all of these different components to be able to say, okay, we're going to take an eroding shoreline right here in Sherman Creek Park, and we're going to build this living shoreline with integrated hard structures, vegetation, and we're going to get these nature's contributions to people by doing this. And so it's, when we say we're going to build something, we're doing a construction project, it's complicated. And there's a lot of pieces that go into it. And I think that's why it's really important that we all can find a place to contribute. As an ecologist, my work is very much, on trying to understand some of the ecological benefits associated with building these living shorelines and maximizing the ecosystem services or ecosystem benefits that come from them. Thank you. And so some of the things that we're focused on in my work is habitat provisioning, creating habitat for enhancing biological life, the organisms and wildlife and birds and invertebrates, which I'll talk about today. And then, of course, shoreline resilience, because we're building these things because of threats to the shorelines, and so we want to make sure that they're providing that benefit. And then I spent a lot of time talking about nutrient mitigation, and that gives Jason a headache. But it's in my mind, it's really exciting stuff. Thinking about how we can improve water quality by building these kinds of shorelines and sequestering carbon. And next week's talk is going to be really much focused on these kinds of things. And so I encourage you all to come, and Professor Aldred is a great speaker. So my work is kind of focused on these ecological issues. It's good. It's good. I can't stand still, so I'm just gonna trip on it for the next 25 minutes. Okay, so we've really take there's these three areas that we're focused on, and we're trying to understand and assess these living shoreline projects: the habitat provisioning, the resilience, shoreline resilience, and then the ecosystem effects like carbon and nitrogen cycling. I'm going to focus on the habitat provisioning today. And so broadly, we want to evaluate the effectiveness of these projects, and specifically how we can promote biodiversity in these highly urbanized systems. We know that these systems are challenged for many different reasons. Can we create this habitat that then encourages organisms to be able to thrive within these habitats? And then what we also know is that all these living shoreline projects are taking slightly different approaches. One group is building this way, one group is building another way, and that's good. It's helpful to sort of test out these different approaches. But we really need to be able to align these different approaches, these different designs, with some of the ecological value, ecological enhancements. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about design and what are the implications of the design. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different pieces of work that we've done, starting with Sherman Creek. And so, again, this is a pre-construction of the living shoreline at Sherman Creek in 2019. Quite a bit of erosion. Some of the uplands were starting to erode and fall into the river. And I think most people have been down there and have seen that. And then in 2020, they built this wave attenuator, which is made out of oyster castles. So these are like cement blocks that are kind of like Legos, and you kind of build these little walls to block some of the waves, which should then allow for the vegetation to grow. As the vegetation grows, it stabilizes the shoreline and reduces wave energy in addition to the oyster castles, and thereby protecting the uplands. So one of the ideas with the oyster castles is that as the name implies, that these blocks are designed to be able to attract oysters to grow on those blocks, and we're familiar with oysters and some of the ecological benefits associated with oysters. Filtering the water, enhancing nitrogen cycling, creating habitat by building reefs. So it'd be really great and interesting to see if these oyster castles can provide those benefits, and will oysters attach to them? Will they grow? Will they survive? And so that was one of the pieces that we started exploring immediately after construction of the living shoreline in 2020. So these things were built in this sort of this shape here, where you have these little peaks, and then you have a little valley and a peak and a valley, and we called these units. We kind of separated these out, these units, and what we ended up doing is at the end of the season in 2020, so it's I think fall 2020. These were, I think, established June 2020. We ended up sampling along these oyster castles, and we sampled about half of them that are out there. Was there 43 that are out there? And we sampled both the inshore and the offshore sides of these things, and we sampled at different levels. So you can imagine it's like these little pyramids. Where are the oysters going to attach? Or where would they prefer to attach? They're going to want to have some, elevation where they get enough food. They're submerged long enough to get enough food, but they also probably don't want to be submerged so much that they're exposed to predators. And there's quite a bit of predators like blue crabs down in the river. So we need to figure out where exactly might they want to go, and if they come at all. And so we established this sort of sampling regime, and we went out there and surveyed the blocks, counted oysters, live oysters, and we also measured the elevation of the blocks, so how high the blocks are relative to sea level. And in 2020, what we found is we got a lot of oysters. We had a pretty terrific set of oysters. And so these are just 3 different areas along the shoreline. And what we found is that the blocks closer to the bottom had the greatest density of oysters, in some cases over 1,000 oysters per square meter. And then we did find some oysters in sort of the middle of those pyramids, and found very few oysters near the peak of those pyramids. And so these things were put out in June. We're sampling them in the fall, and so those oysters that did enter. Can we hit admit just so that that's not on there? Okay, yeah, terrific. So they grew quite well. The oysters grew quite well, up to 20 millimeters at the end of the growing season. So oyster set on the oyster castles, and they grew throughout the season. So that was all really, really good news. And then we looked at the relationship of the oyster castles elevation and the density. And I think this is a sort of a pretty important point because we are thinking about oyster restoration in and around New York City. Partner organizations are thinking about oyster restoration, particularly in the intertidal zone. There are some places that are looking at using oyster castles in other areas around New York City. And so one of the questions is, well, where are they most likely to set, and along that intertidal gradient, and can we identify that area and then hone in on that area with all of our restoration efforts, all of our seeding, all of our what have you. And the beauty here is that what we found is that there's a very specific range where you get lots of oyster density. Basically from equal to sea level to around minus 0.3 meters, you get the highest densities of these oysters. And so we're measuring it vertically on these oyster castles. But what you want to do is you want to think about that in terms of an intertidal zone, that now you can just kind of turn it this way. And now you can think where you want to target your oyster restoration in that 0 to minus 3 meter range. And so now you have a very specific area where the oysters can set, where they can survive, and where they can grow. So we thought this was a pretty neat result. And so this was the data that we collected in 2020, and we went back to the next year. And so now what we're looking at is oyster density in 2020, which is what I just showed you. And here's oyster density in 2021, and you can see the numbers dropped quite a bit. All right, and so we had much lower density of oysters in 2021, and of course we were able to see that a lot of the oysters were dead. You can count the dead, and so what happened here? What's causing the mortality? We went back and measured in 22 and 23, and we had the same thing. Not a lot of oysters growing on these things. And so I haven't been out in the last 2 years, so I don't know what the current situation is. But there are a lot of possibilities that are causing this kind of mortality, and one of which is predation. Things could be eating the oysters, and there are many other possibilities as well. But I think if we want to maximize the ecological benefits from using oyster castles as a tool for wave mitigation in living shoreline projects, we need to figure out what's causing these kinds of mortality and how we can maintain these oyster densities, and if it is even possible. So I'm going to come back to this idea towards the end of the presentation. But I'm gonna fly you over to a different part of New York City where we spend a lot of time, and this is Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge in Broad Channel, Queens, which is part of Gateway National Recreation Area. And there's a really beautiful trail around a artificial pond called the West Pond, and the shoreline, the south shoreline of the West Pond is experiencing quite a bit of erosion, and there was concern that like during Hurricane Sandy, this area could breach. That happened during Hurricane Sandy, could breach again and have negative impacts on the ecosystem. So Jamaica Bay Rockaway Parks Conservancy and the National Park Service worked together to come up with a plan to build a living shoreline, a 14-acre living shoreline. So one of the biggest that I'm aware of, living shorelines that I'm aware of in New York City. And they were able to build this in 2021. And the approach that they took is that they wanted to use all natural materials as in the living shoreline, and not use things like oyster castles or rock revetment or riprap. Try to use a natural approach. And so they piloted this idea of creating breakwaters using bags of shell, oyster shell, clam shell. And they also tested out some other things like using tree fascines, using like Christmas trees as a jetty, kind of. So that was cool. And they used core logs as well, coconut fiber logs. And this is what it looked like. They worked with the Billion Oyster Project on this, and so they had these bags of shell, and the bags were made out of burlap. And then and you can see the bags are kind of staked in, and then they kind of wrapped the bags in more burlap. And so they were kind of like these shell tacos that were placed all along the shoreline, and with the goal of creating a wave break, mitigating some of that wave energy. And so what happened here is that in less than a year, that burlap eroded, and all of the shell bags dumped out and released the shells. And so you're getting no wave mitigation whatsoever from these shell bags. And so, okay, we're not getting any wave mitigation from here. So what do we do with this? Does this still have value? And so that was one of the questions that my students and I asked. This was a part of a course-based research project in my invertebrate biology class. And so there's 3 areas where there were these shell bags along the shoreline here, and some areas were more eroded than others. And basically, the way that sort of translated is that the places where there was less erosion, the bags were more not intact, but the shells were more intact, and there was some vertical complexity. While in areas where there was more erosion, it was more flat, and the shells were kind of spread out. And so the students hypothesized that where you had more vertical complexity, you would get greater invertebrate biodiversity. And so we set up an experiment to go ahead and measure that. And so we went out and used quadrat sampling, and which is a common approach that we use, and to sorted through the shells and identified all the organisms that are living in the shells. And it turns out that just quite a few. We had over 12 species that were living in the shells, with barnacles, amphipods, and mud snails being the most common. But we also had sea anemones, which you don't really think too much about being common in New York. Sea anemones and even had some rib mussels living in those shells as well. And so this is taxa density, so the number of different organisms per unit area, and this is the intact versus the more eroded sites. And so we tended to see greater number of organisms in the intact, more vertical complexity, and then same for biodiversity. We saw this pattern of greater biodiversity with more vertical complexity. So the rib mussels, I think, is another sort of interesting story. We've been thinking about rib mussels for a number of years. The rib mussels live in the vegetation. So when you build these living shorelines, almost every living shoreline project is going to have salt marsh grass planted, and in particular, the Spartina alterniflora, the smooth cordgrass is going to be the plant that's there. And there's a mutualism, an interaction between the rib mussels and the Spartina that's beneficial to both species. And that's why you'll often find the rib mussels living in and among these marsh grasses. And so what's I think important to point out is that when you do living shoreline projects, or you do large scale marsh restoration projects that were done like in Jamaica Bay, where we're talking about 20 acres, 40 acres of marsh islands, you grade it, you create the right elevation, and then you put these juvenile plants, baby plants in there, and we call them plugs, and they grow, and what you hope is that the mussels are going to show up, and then you'll have this interaction that benefits them, and perhaps can make these projects more resilient by having that interaction. But we don't include them, and we don't include them for a number of reasons. One is that they are they're not produced commercially like oysters are or clams are, and so there's a lot of research that still needs to be done on how to produce rib mussels in a hatchery, and there's a group that's working on that now. And so that's one reason, and the other reason is that it's going to add costs. But the hope is that if you build the grass, the mussels will come. And so that's one of the things that we think about and we explore when we do the research and monitoring on these living shoreline projects. This is a data set from the National Park Service, where they were monitoring some of those large islands in Jamaica Bay that were restored. And this one is called Elders East. And Elders East was constructed in 2006, and so they did pre-construction sampling and found very, very few mussels. 2006 they built it. 2008 they start to find some more mussels, and then 9 through 12 you see more and more mussels. And what happens is that the mussels that are in the water column, the juvenile mussels that are in the water column, so will settle out and prefer to settle to bottoms where there are other mussels. They're attracted to conspecifics. And so you end up getting what we call a recruitment cascade. Some mussels attract more mussels. The more mussels you have, the more mussels you attract, and so on and so on. And so you have this recruitment cascade, and we've seen stuff like this happen in Jamaica Bay in these large scale restoration projects, and we've seen it happen in the West Pond living shoreline where we've been working. And so we have 100 plots or something like that out there. And each year that we've done our monitoring, we tend to see more mussels. And so this year we had the greatest number of mussels that we observed. And with this idea of there being a recruitment cascade, we would expect to see more mussels in years to come. And typically, if we think about Elders East and other restoration locations around the city, West Pond, 3 years seems to be sort of a tipping point. And it's typically 3 years post-construction where the vegetation, the above ground vegetation, gets dense enough that it's equivalent to what a natural marsh would have in terms of vegetation cover. And so for some reason, there's this, that's sort of a trigger where you start to see these mussels come in and grow, and the population start to take off. And that goes with other species as well, rib mussels, fiddler crabs, which tend to live more on the higher parts of the marsh, and then mud snails, all at West Pond, have shown increases through time. And so we can go back to Sherman and, thinking about the oysters. We've had that oyster discussion. Now, one of the things that we did at Sherman Creek was, built this marsh. What if we add the mussels from the outset? And could we jumpstart the population? And would that make the shoreline more resilient? And so we created this experiment where we set up these plots throughout the shoreline, and we added mussels. We transplanted them from Jamaica Bay, adult mussels, transplanted them from Jamaica Bay, and to see what would happen. And I don't know, we think we probably put out 2,000, 3,000 mussels. And a week later, I came back, and this is what I found. Mussel shells all crunched up and dead mussel shells, mussels everywhere. And I said, "Oh, this is terrible." And so, all right, I'm going to take the mussels and put them in cages. And so I put them in cages. Came back a week later, cages are gone. Then I built these giant pens, chicken wire pens, and put the mussels in. Things got in there and ate them, and as you probably guessed, raccoons. So there is a tremendous number of raccoons living right here in the park, and or at least one family that's really hungry. I don't know if how many there are out there, but that they did a number on this mussel experiment. And so the question is, okay, they really like the mussels. Do they like the oysters too? And will always see raccoon tracks around the oyster castles. And so, is it possible that what's keeping the oyster population from expanding on these oyster castles is this terrestrial predator? And it's well known that raccoons are intertidal scavengers on oysters in other parts of the United States. And so in this case where we're trying to build this living shoreline with these oysters in a challenging urbanized environment, having that one extra pressure is probably just too much. And so I think one of the things that could be really interesting to think about is, could we get to a point by management interventions, by protecting baby oysters and mussels, can we get to a point where they can grow, survive, and reproduce, where the numbers are just too big for raccoons to be able to have an impact on them? Because I showed you pictures of the mussel populations in Jamaica Bay, and you can find them up to 10,000 mussels per square meter in Jamaica Bay. And I'm sure raccoons eat some of those mussels, but it's just the sheer number of mussels is too great for the raccoons. And the raccoons also don't think, it's my understanding, the raccoons don't like to weave through very dense marsh grass. And so the edges are probably more likely to get picked out than centers. So I think this is sort of an interesting question, an interesting idea that folks can work on and think about how to move this forward so that we can maximize ecological impacts of these structures. So I kind of walked you between West Pond and Sherman Creek. we've also spent quite a bit of time at Randall's Island. And there they use riprap, rocky riprap as a shoreline approach. And I spent some time and quite a bit of work at Gansevoort Peninsula, which is the Hudson River Park Trust, right next to Little Island. There's a little salt marsh that they built there, and they built rock revetment around the whole thing. And so there's all these different approaches that are being put into place, and we're slowly building knowledge about these different approaches, what works, what doesn't work, and in what context. Because all the sites are really different. Here, one of the major challenges in terms of shoreline erosion is the circle line that goes by a couple times a day and throws huge weight. Hudson River Park Trust, they have to deal with all the boat traffic and all the wakes of ferry boats and other stuff. In Jamaica Bay, it's wind fetch. That's one of the big problems. So every place is a little bit different. You have to have that site-specific context. And I think, the more that we can build science into these projects that are happening all over the city, the better off we'll be in being able to predict the success of the resiliency and biodiversity. So I can just thank all of our partners and all of the collaborators, the number of students, researchers that we've worked with, and I'm happy to. Is a good time to have questions. And
well, I think we'd like to have we'll take like a 10-minute break and then come back for a longer Q&A.
Okay.
But also, while you have the partners out there, I just want to shout out the New York City Parks Department, which everything NYRP does on parkland is in partnership with the Parks Department, and they have a fantastic team of wetland scientists who have kind of guided us and supported us in this work. And we're going to take a 10-minute break, and we're going to be very strict about it. I'm going to start yelling at 5 minutes to 11. So that'll be 10:55. We'll come back for some Q&A. But you folks can stretch your legs. And thank you, Chester. That was a lot to think about.
And I'll check this strap here.
Yeah, and we but the video's working.
It is.
Like inside it.
We had really bad luck because that year the raccoon population was
It's back on.
Yeah. But yeah, what did you? I think you asked for this. Oh, you did? Oh, cool. Okay, well, you know better than I do about the program. I'll probably it is reasonable. Did you enjoy, did you make a lot of connections, there? Okay, cool. Through school, I wondered why I went to school, that I ended up either here in New York City or California, the other big, like, technology.
Are you teaching this semester?
Yep.
How's it going?
Yeah, well, never mind.
No,
Let's return our attention here. We got a few questions on the chat, so we're gonna start with those. So folks online know that we're thinking of them. So Kaio, if you could start with those and then we'll come back to the room.
Okay, so the first question is, who is working on hatching ribbed mussels? Okay,
yeah, so there are a number of shellfish hatcheries that are interested in working on rib mussels, mainly because they've been getting inquiries about obtaining them. People that are working on living shoreline projects, people that are exploring ways of using rib mussels to address water quality issues. There's a group that, including myself, that's created a collaborative. We call it the Rib Mussel Aquaculture Collaborative, RMAC. The RMAC's website is going to come live, I think, at the end of the month. But it's Rutgers University, Martha's Vineyard Shellfish Group, which is up in Massachusetts, Cornell Cooperative Extension out in Suffolk County. And so all of them have been working on producing rib mussels and have had success producing them in a hatchery. Getting consistent success and scaling it is two of the big hurdles that we're faced with. And so the collaborative has been writing grants, trying to get some more funding to work through some of those challenges. You think about oyster and clam aquaculture. We've literally been working on oyster culture for over a century. People have been producing oysters since the 1800s. Rib mussels is new, and so it's going to take some time to really be able to work out the kinks of the hatchery production and then grow out after that.
the second question is regarding the many different types of invertebrates found at Jamaica Bay. How do they interact with each other, and if at all, and are there invasive species present?
So yeah, so there are certainly interactions, things like predator-prey interactions, I think are probably a pretty prominent one in those shell mounds. And there are invasive species. So I'll give you one quick example. You have mud crabs, which are a native species that live in those shell mounds, and then there's another species, the Pacific shore crab, that's invasive, and both of them can eat juvenile rib mussels. And so I'm sure that there's quite a few rib mussels that are setting to those shell mounds and are being consumed by those crabs. But we do find the mussels in there. We have found mussels in those shell mounds. Once they get to a certain size, they're a little bit less likely to be eaten by those little crabs.
Another question is regarding volunteer. Is it possible to help and volunteer on these current projects? I've been involved in shark field research in Miami, but I've been interested in getting more involved in the waterways and biodiversity. And related to that question, there is another one saying if it's volunteering is only on field, is primarily for students or people already in the science industry, or if there are opportunities for people in other fields.
Yeah, so the answer is yes to both. There are plenty of opportunities to get involved, and you don't have to have a science background to get involved. I think one of the goals of today's session is to expand the sort of volunteer options. Jason?
Yeah, so certainly with MRP, we're relaunching our volunteer program on the shoreline. And one component of that is monitoring and community science. And so one of the things we want to accomplish today is get a sense of what people are interested in. For example, if we wanted to dig into, as a community, Chester's question of what happened to our oysters, we could try to do that, right? So he hasn't had the time to come back and re-monitor those sites. So we could do that as a group of volunteers with MRP staff. And so if folks online or in the room have specific ideas, then now's a great time to share them. But whatever, even if you don't and you just want to come help out, absolutely. If you can make it up to Sherman Creek, we'll be having expanded volunteer opportunities in the intertidal zone this year.
And the final question from the group chat here is, have you continued research work at Jamaica Bay? If so, how has the change in administration impacted your ability to work there, like permit review and access concerns?
Yeah, so we do continue to work in Jamaica Bay at the Wildlife Refuge. The Science and Resilience Institute Jamaica Bay is working with the Jamaica Bay Rockaway Parks Conservancy and the National Park Service to do the monitoring. It's a 5-year monitoring plan. Next year is our 5th year. Beyond that, I'm not sure what the monitoring will look like into the future, but we're thinking about ways in which it can be done in more of a citizen science type capacity. And so there are some approaches that we're talking about for that. We haven't really had issues with the government shutdown. The park was still accessible, but there are certainly challenges that come up with that and are too many to get into. I think here.
And that's it. Is that it for the online at the moment? But
yeah,
we'll circle back to the Zoom chat. So we'll have plenty of time for more questions. So please feel free to plug them in for Chester. And then we'll open it up to this room. But before we do that, I have a very softball for you. Do you have a favorite marine invertebrate?
So my favorite probably would be horseshoe crabs. I spent, when I was a graduate student, I spent a bunch of time working on aquaculture methods for horseshoe crabs. And so I think they're just amazing, fascinating organisms, so important. And so probably my favorite. Yeah.
How are they doing? And in our estuary, do you think the law will make a difference with their populations?
Yeah, I do think the law will help for sure.
So New York State just banned harvesting them for pharmaceuticals or bait. I think
a phase-in period. Yeah, a phase-in. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly it'll help. I think enforcement of the law is going to be really important as well. There's still quite a bit of poaching that happens. I think our enforcement agents are understaffed. It's impossible to cover all of New York City, in particular like Jamaica Bay, where you have probably the most significant spawning habitat in New York and at Plum Beach. And then one of the things that's really interesting is that the marsh island restoration projects in Jamaica Bay create horseshoe crab habitat, and so we don't know a whole lot about how much they're using it. We know they're using it, but we haven't gone out there and quantitatively sampled. We don't know if it's half as important as Plum Beach or twice as important as Plum Beach. So I think that there's some need to do some work on that end. It's something that we've been toying with, and if we can find some funding to do that, we certainly will.
Anyone out here have any follow-up questions for Chester?
I'm just curious, like, could this be like an accessible way for families and young children to volunteer, or could it be pitched to schools? I work for a school or a CBO, and we have a whole topic on like marine life and vertebrates, and so it would be actually like a really amazing way for them to experience this firsthand. So I'm just curious that it might be the 3-year-old.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure, I 100% agree. Um, yeah, there are plenty of opportunities to kind of integrate K through 12, 3-year-olds, whatever it might be, families. I haven't done a whole lot of it myself. But I know that partners like Hudson River Park Trust, Randall's Island Park Alliance, New York City Parks offers lots of really great educational programs. So there are lots of opportunities. I mean, every week you can go to a different New York City Parks educational program around the city. Like there's just so many of them. It's really impressive. So Billion Oyster is another one that connects. So there are lots of these nonprofits that have education wings that are able to do that.
And I will say for folks that are close to Sherman Creek, NYRP doesn't do youth environmental education as much as we used to, but we have a great beach for seining, which is a wonderful way to get, probably not great for 3-year-olds, but elementary school students can actually get out in the water and use a net to catch marine invertebrates. And it was probably one of the most transformative education experiences I've seen out here, is young kids realizing they can get in the river and that it's filled with life. And so that can be done out here at Sherman Creek by educators who come to the space. We're not running it anymore, but there's also other places in the city that are good for seining. If you have 3-year-olds, you can even get a bucket and bring it on land, and then they can see what's there. So folks can always reach out to me and Kyle to coordinate that kind of activity here at Sherman Creek.
And I think that that piece is really important in New York City in particular. I grew up in the Bronx. I as a kid I spent a lot of time around the water, but all my friends were like, "Why are you going by the water? Why are you going fishing? Why are you?" They don't have the same connection to the waterfront, and so I think it's really important for us to foster a connection, to foster a sense of stewardship to our waterfront, to our natural resources, because that is the way in which we're going to get policies that promote living shorelines, that promote waterfront access, that promote ecologically sustainable systems to minimize pollution. Like all these critical things, we need people to care about it. I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys are all here, but I think it's really important that we serve as educators and we try to bring as many people into this circle. This way we all benefit.
Were those oyster castles remotely set, or was there a natural?
It was a natural set. Yeah, natural set.
Yeah. You were talking about how there's a lot of variance in the approaches to these different shoreline projects, and how it's a lot of it's still really experimental. Are you aware of any centralized place where some of these findings are being collected or compared, or and also as you're thinking about community science, is there a framework for experiment design, or how to approach kind of collecting that knowledge?
Yeah, so to answer the first part of the question, there's been a significant amount of effort to try and centralize knowledge gained from living shorelines, and I'd say at the national level it's happening through Restore America's Estuaries program, and so they've been hosting lots of living shoreline workshops and ways in which people can get organized. At the state level, there's been a lot of interest in trying to develop ways to monitor, standardized monitoring approaches. And so New York Sea grants, Science Resilience Institute, Jamaica Bay, and other partners have been working on trying to develop a citizen science friendly approach to monitoring these living shoreline projects. So there is some effort there. And I think one of the things that's probably important to point out is that New York City is kind of its own beast. When you start trying to compare to things nationally, we know that for sure with 2 decades of oyster restoration research, It's just different. It's just different here. There's different constraints. And so you always have to keep that in mind as you're learning. You want to learn from these other projects elsewhere and think about how that could work here. And then, there are probably things that we're doing here that we need to share with other people elsewhere. Did I answer all the questions? Yeah. Okay.
But it's safe to say that there's not like a framework that's easily accessible right now for citizen scientists to like, that's really user friendly to get into monitoring. It would be more of a custom effort at this point.
So, I don't, there is a statewide protocol. I don't know if that's live yet. It might still be in the research phase, but there is a statewide protocol that's being, that has been developed and being tested.
Is that the DOS?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's coming down the line.
I know at some point, in case you may know the status of this project, New York City Parks was talking about adding a park to the north shore of this cove. You were talking earlier about including experimentation in new construction projects. In your ideal world, what kind of experiments would you like to see when or if this north shore gets developed into a park?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely want to see what some of the planning is, some of the engineering drawings and stuff like that. But I think that there's still a lot of opportunity to explore the oyster component because I surprised Shane when I said that they're wild set. I mean, there's wild set happening every year along the shoreline. And so it'd be neat to be able to try to find a way to take advantage of that. I think that if you go up into Inwood Park, not that far from here, there's like little remnant pockets of salt marsh, and you'll find rib mussels there. And so we know there's rib mussels all in the water column in the Harlem River. Can we promote settlement and success? So I think those are a couple of key things. I didn't spend a lot of time talking about all of our other invertebrate surveys that we do. Like we study who's living on top of the sediment in the different kinds of habitats, who's in the sediment. And so there's another whole story that you can dig into literally on invertebrate biodiversity when you build these things.
Are any of these sites in need of like base remediation before you can start nature-based restoration on them, or
Yeah, for sure.
did you have to do that work before you started?
Yeah, so just to be clear, I didn't plan any of these projects. I just was fortunate enough to kind of find my way into research and monitoring on them. Yeah, a lot of times you do some kind of remediation at the site, and that could be costly and can hold up the process quite a bit. Jason, I don't know did you guys have to do anything along those lines?
The Sherman Creek project where you saw the slides, there wasn't a need for remediation, but we also didn't do a lot of testing, right? So that's I think it's a really important issue for the public to get involved in because there's a lot of concern about testing and not a ton of transparency because it can trigger questions of legal requirements to mitigate things as well as like liability and all kinds of things that make people nervous. But it's like, as citizens like of Inwood who want to use Sherman Creek, like I think it's important for us to advocate for like very transparent conversations around what's in the sediment. And then we certainly, so MRP is planning a next phase of restoration here at Sherman Creek. And the first phase that we were looking at was that Chester showed those slides was on the Harlem River in pretty well mixed sandy sediments, and we were less concerned. We're a little more concerned about contamination in the inlet here. So we've done some preliminary testing, and now we're sort of just grappling with like, all right, now that we know that, what are the responsible next steps to figure out? We have heavy metals in the muds, and so I don't know if Judy got into it last week, but wetland grasses can bring heavy metals up into the ecosystem. And so then we have to think about, do you want to remove those sediments? Do you want to cap them? Do you want to not do anything because you're concerned about, metals? And I think the most important thing is that we, don't let that scare us and think about what we want to see. And I think over here, it's a real environmental justice issue. And it really just, we actually need to just, even though I think everyone we work with wouldn't consciously think about it, but you have to be like, the Harlem River could be better. It should be clean, it should be safe, it should be accessible. And so what do we need to do to get that? And it's a big question to think about, well, what's in the mud and what's an acceptable level? And there's not easy answers to all those questions. And one of the questions I had for Chester, so personally, I think one of the best things we can do when we think about legacy of industrial contamination in our sediment throughout the estuary, as well as sea level rise, is we just putting clean sand and clean fill on top is probably, I think, oftentimes the best solution. But there's a lot of, like the current best guidance from the state, which is responsible for protecting our natural resources, is to try to minimize filling. And so I was wondering if you have any thoughts from like an invertebrate's point of view. Like obviously an invertebrate doesn't want to be buried in 2 meters of sand, but like long term for invertebrate habitat, do you have a point of view on the benefits or downside of kind of like clean fill to cap contaminated sites as an approach?
Yeah, I mean, it could, in most of these places like the inlet here where you might cap, the sediment has a certain grain size. It's like really fine and organic-y. And that kind of sediment is really good for certain kinds of organisms, but not others. When you put a sand on there where it's a little bit more coarser, less organic, that might be better for other organisms. And so there is going to be this sort of transition of who's living there. And I think it's probably a good idea to figure out who's living there, what they're doing, and is it okay if we cap over them? And I think that's sort of a broad approach.
And just for Sherman Creek, that we did that step. So we did pretty intensive sampling of all the worms and crustaceans and snails that are living in the mud out here, and some limited contaminant sampling. And so we have all that info, and now we have to think, well, how do we make sense of that, and what's the responsible thing to do with it?
Apropos what you said about the plants concentrating the metals. So that stays in the tissue and then could be harvested at the end of the year. And then you have to deal with, of course, where that's going to be disposed of.
Yeah. So
but in what they call phytoremediation.
I think and again, limited experience. I think for the wetlands, we would probably rather than hyperaccumulators that are concentrating the metals. One reason why we're happy to have Phragmites here is because unlike Spartina, they don't suck up the metals, because collecting from hyperaccumulators works a lot better on land. You don't necessarily want to be out harvesting your wetland every year to catch those metals. That would be very disruptive to the wetland.
Yeah.
So I think the idea of hyperaccumulators in the wetland, I haven't heard of that being like a desirable outcome, but I think it's definitely a good way to think about if we can avoid, dredging and filling and industrial approaches, Do we have, can we check back with the chat and see if there's any more questions from there?
Yes.
We could always do an experiment there. I think that we'd have to think about the regulations and the safety and stuff, but.
Okay, one of the comments in the chat here is, aside from growing mussels, do you have experience or thoughts about transplanting mussels from existing populations to use in restoration? And if so, are there major permitting implications? We have found the same results for mussels colonizing a few years after restoration, but I'm wondering if it might be possible to transplant a small number of mussels, ideally from nearby, distributing them across the site to help facilitate colonization.
Yeah, so we have worked on that on an experimental level, not at its scale. Basically, yeah, you need to get a permit if you're going to move mussels around, and that's a state permit. And depending on where you are, it might require a federal permit or a city permit. Some of our research has shown in Jamaica Bay that we know that salt marshes are eroding away. And what happens is you have the salt marsh and the mussels living together, and as it starts to erode, the plants die off, and you still have the mussels there, and it continues to erode and erode, and then you just have this sort of bed of mussels. The mussels are able to persist. We call them remnant mussel beds, and so in order to do research on transplanting, our permits were to collect from these remnant mussel beds where there wasn't this mutualistic interaction. And eventually these remnant mussel beds were going to get buried by sediment. So we harvested from there and transplanted. I think that there is going to be cases where some salt marsh habitat is going to be restored by dumping sand on it to increase the elevation. And that means burying mussels. And maybe it would be beneficial for us to, or whoever, to harvest those mussels rather than just bury them and transplant them in a living shoreline site or something like that. So I think there are ways that that can be where you can do this transplant work and not have a negative impact on salt marsh habitat. But I think that's the key, right? Because you don't want to go in there and harvest and destructively sample on a functional living salt marsh, because that wouldn't be helpful at all.
Can we do another one?
Sure.
Another one is that we also often see horseshoe crabs using our restoration sites on New York City park shorelines. A lot of our salt marshes and shoreline restoration projects use clean sand as the substrate for plants, and we often see baby horse crabs hanging out in our sites, especially in Sunset Cove in Jamaica Bay. It's just a comment here. I don't know if you know him, Chris. Hey.
Yeah. Hey, Chris. Yeah, there's been just a sort of flurry of papers that have just got published in the last year or two that document the importance of salt marshes as horseshoe crab spawning habitat. I think that they've been sort of they haven't really been considered as important habitat, but these new papers that just came out have documented that, not just in New York but elsewhere. And in particular, restored habitat, I think, is likely to serve as good horseshoe crab habitat. The key, I think, is a lot about capturing the right grain size of the sediment for them to nest in. I think a really perfect case study is at Plum Beach. Right before Hurricane Sandy, Army Corps of Engineers restored part of Plum Beach along the Belt Parkway. And they built these jetties and groins and whatnot. And that was really prime horseshoe crab habitat. But Mark Botten at Fordham University and Christina Colon at Kingsborough Community College clearly showed that crabs don't like spawning in that newly constructed shoreline. And they do most of their spawning to the east along Plum Beach that was not restored. So there's some caveats, but certainly, I think that there's a lot of potential to document, quantify, study horseshoe crabs using living shoreline salt marsh restoration projects around the city.
Can I jump in and ask a question? So I think I really appreciate your point of view that there's been this gain of knowledge and expertise through piloting, and that there's a growth of that. Sometimes I feel like when we're, as a city or an estuary making this decision of how we're going to adapt the shoreline, that the desire to build walls is sort of winning over the interest in building more living shorelines where it's possible. Do you have a feeling like overall if we're making progress with kind of seeing more living shorelines gain credibility and be used more expansively?
Yeah, so I've been able to speak with a few of the main engineering firms that work on design plans for living shorelines and bulkheads as well. And the general feeling is that we're starting to see this shift where the cost benefit analysis favors living shorelines. And so you're starting to see more of that. Where we've had some discussions with private property owners around the city who have to replace bulkheads that are aging out, and they're thinking about living shorelines as well. They're not thinking about it; they're moving ahead with it.
That's good to have some good news.
Yeah.
Can I ask another question about that? I thought that you described the living shoreline as having these like social and ecological benefits. I had thought that in some cases they were also better than like hard features at like flood resilience. Is that true, or I'm sure it's contextual, but like.
Yeah, it's like a big depends is the answer to that. Because there isn't a whole lot of like measurements that are being taken of how effective these things are. Probably the best indicator is whether or not the plants are surviving. Because if the hydrology didn't support the plants would just disappear. But there is a need to be measuring some of these physical parameters, current, wave energy, wave height, those kinds of things on these projects as well.
And I think you used a very important word in your question. You said that are the living shorelines more resilient, and I think that's where on like a conceptual level, I think they're different than walls because the wall is something that theoretically, if it fails catastrophically. And I think the idea is that a living shoreline can be underwater, like our park here in Hurricane Sandy, and then it's okay. And it recovers the ecological function, even if it doesn't keep 100% of the floodwaters out. And so I think when we think about the long-term challenge of pretty extreme sea level rise, my hope is that we can start to make the case for these solutions that are more truly resilient rather than like the way I'm trying not to use the word because I think it's kind of been taken over by thinking about the biggest wall being the most resilient thing. But
I think it's just really taking like a holistic approach to it, thinking about, short-term, long-term, social benefits, ecological benefits, holistically. I think there's this shift to living shorelines being more attractive.
We don't have to, we can stop in a couple minutes. Are there any other burning issues on the chat?
No, I think there's just a comment saying that the New York City Parks Natural Resource Group has the wetlands and conservation teams who work on monitoring living shorelines, and then they shared the link if anyone wants to go, and I can share with everyone later.
Great.
Final two questions. One is, did you, in the subtidal oyster towers, do they suffer the same rates of predation? I'm not sure you had subtidal ones here at Sherman Creek, but do you know if they suffer the same rate of predation maybe for the crab, even though they're out of the way of raccoon ravaging? But have they been more successful here?
So there were no subtitle efforts here, but I know that's most of the Billion Oyster Project's work is subtitle, and they have to. Oh, not with oyster castles, but just but with any other of their approaches, there's definitely predation. Yeah.
And the second one, when you mentioned the horseshoe crab, that new area, was there a difference in grain size between the? So you think that might have been the?
That's the hypothesis, yeah, and not me. It's the work of Botten and Cologne.
We found, by the way, a positive note of horseshoe crab larvae in Newtown Creek.
All right.
Do you have any go-to resources or advice that you would give your students for the basics of invertebrate IDs? I'm thinking especially like our bivalves, like walking along the waterfront, I wouldn't be able to point out an oyster versus a ribbed mussel, and I'd love to know how.
Yeah. So there's like field guides, like a Peterson field guide, and there's some field guides that are like just like a little pamphlet. It's and I think those are really helpful. There's like resources like iNaturalist.
Yeah.
And you can always use those. And
Feel they work on invertebrates?
oh yeah,
Okay,
Oh, yeah.
like, okay.
yep, for sure. And Billion Oyster Project has a bunch of pamphlets of local species,
Okay.
and so you can always just keep that on your phone.
Kyle, we're done on the chat.
Yes, I'm just preparing the poll.
Great.
with the
Yeah, so online, Kyle's preparing 2 questions, and we have the same questions here. If you were here last week, it's the same drill. Sorry. And if you don't do it, AdWords is gonna play that again. The questions are, right, did any of this spark any questions that you have that we should explore? And is there anything that we talked about that you would like to work with MRP on here up at Sherman Creek? And we left the notes from last week, which was our marine pollution conversation with Dr. Weiss. And so if you have answers to those questions, please write them down or type them in the chat. And then if you see something else from this week that someone else did, or from last week that you think is a good idea that you didn't have, put a sticker on it. It doesn't matter. The colors are arbitrary. It's just notes and then votes. So that's the idea. Online, you don't have the opportunity to vote, but we are going to 10 minutes after Kyle posts the questions, he will post the results. So you can hang around and see what other folks are thinking. And we are also, this is a new process for us, but as we get our act together and share the recordings with attendees, we will also share the results with everyone from each event we're having. And then maybe before we get into this activity, I'll just in case anyone is desperate to leave, I'll say thank you so much for coming on this cold day. This is the Sherman Creek Center, part of Sherman Creek Park, and it's a community resource. So if anyone wants to use this room for a meeting or a lecture connected to parks, science, open space, you can hop on our website. There's sort of limited availability because this room serves a lot of purposes, but keep that in mind. And we hope to stay in touch and see all of you throughout the year when we relaunch Sherman Creek Stewards Program, sponsored by Con Ed, coming back to the park this May. So I'll leave it at that, and please take a minute and think about the answers to those questions. Let us know what your thoughts are.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next week, Dr. Aldred, Valentine's special, learning to love a wetland and how they function.
Can't miss the seminar next week.
Yeah, I was either, I thought that I had been emailing Jason Sheets, but I realized that.
Yeah.
I ran into you at some point.
There's like
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I feel like the elevation is getting, it's near a point where I'd be surprised. But it seems like it's sort of inching, past the fencing. So you know, it might be interesting to see if we can facilitate it in some way.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah.
Our
Yeah.
example of, when I look at it, I'll be like.
Exactly.